King Charles had made a decision about Camilla's future, and those closest to the palace already understood that once his words were formalized, nothing about her title, her position, or her marriage would survive intact. What had begun as a routine financial audit had quietly become something the British monarchy had never been forced to confront before. A sitting queen consort stripped of every title she carried, removed from the home she shared with her husband, and referred to in an official palace statement by her pre-marriage name all within 72 hours. The speed alone was extraordinary. But the question that nobody had yet fully answered was how a woman who had spent 2 decades painstakingly rebuilding her public reputation had managed to conceal millions across 3 continents, and why that concealment had continued, quietly and deliberately, throughout every year of her marriage to the king. Before we go any further, if you follow the royal family closely, make sure you subscribe now. This story moves fast, and the details that emerge later will completely change how you understand the beginning. But that announcement, released at 13 minutes to 7 on the morning of December the 3rd, only makes sense once you understand what Charles had discovered the night before, behind closed doors, and what he said to the woman sitting across from him when the documentation was finally laid on the desk between them. The statement dropped at 6:47 in the morning, not at 10 o'clock, when press offices typically release prepared communications, not at midday, when royal announcements are usually timed to land cleanly inside a single news cycle. 6:47 in the morning, before most of Britain had reached for a phone, before the morning papers had been fully read, before any royal correspondent had been briefed or warned. That timing was the first signal that something was different. The second signal was the language. Those who had spent years reading official palace communications understood immediately that something in the phrasing was wrong, not grammatically, not diplomatically, but in the way that a single word in the wrong place can change the meaning of everything around it. Buckingham Palace had referred to the Queen Consort not by her title, not by her married name, but as Camilla Parker Bowles. Her pre-marriage name, in an official document, released under the authority of the sovereign. That is not an oversight. In a palace communication, nothing is an oversight. The statement itself was brief. It announced that the king had formally requested parliamentary action regarding the titles and styles held by Camilla Parker Bowles, and that serious financial irregularities and substantial undisclosed accounts had been discovered, making continuation of the Queen Consort title no longer appropriate or tenable. It did not use soft language. It did not offer the diplomatic ambiguity that royal communications typically provide to soften difficult news. It stated, in language that left almost no room for alternative interpretation, that a sitting queen consort was being institutionally removed. Royal correspondents, who had covered the monarchy for 20 or 30 years, used the word unprecedented within minutes of the statement appearing. Some used it more than once in the same sentence, as though repetition might help the reality settle into something comprehensible. Because this had no modern parallel. A queen consort stripped of her titles not through death, not through abdication, not through the death of a sovereign, but through parliamentary action requested by her own husband while their marriage remained technically intact. The constitutional machinery required to accomplish this had not been used in this form within living memory. What made it stranger still was the speed. Financial matters inside any major institution, particularly the monarchy, are typically managed with extraordinary caution. Investigations run quietly for months, legal teams review everything twice, communications departments craft language designed to minimize damage. By the time the public learns anything, the worst of it has already been contained. None of that happened here. From the moment the discovery was made to the morning that statement was released, 5 days had passed. 5 days between a routine audit finding something unexpected and a queen consort losing everything she had spent 20 years earning. That is not institutional caution. That is either evidence so overwhelming it made caution impossible, or a level of personal devastation that overrode every instinct toward careful management. As it turned out, it was both. The institution had made its decision. The machinery had moved with a speed that surprised even those who set it in motion. But inside Clarence House, in the hours before that statement was ever written, what was happening had nothing to do with constitutional procedure or parliamentary process or the careful preservation of the monarchy's public image. What was happening was a man discovering that the person he had loved for nearly 50 years had been carrying a version of herself he had never been permitted to see. Charles had spent a significant portion of his adult life defending Camilla. He had endured decades of public hostility that, at its peak, was visceral and unrelenting. He had watched her be blamed for things that were never entirely her alone to carry. He had advocated for her acceptance, argued for her rehabilitation, stood beside her publicly long before the public was willing to stand beside her in return. He had married her when marrying her was still considered, by a meaningful portion of the British public, an act of poor judgment. He had done all of that because he trusted her completely. That was the foundation. And when foundations crack, everything built upon them collapses simultaneously, not gradually, not selectively, but all at once and without warning. William was summoned to Clarence House at midnight. He found his father not in the formal staterooms where difficult conversations are usually managed, but in a private sitting room, the kind of room where a person goes when they are no longer performing composure for anyone. Charles was not furious in the way that anger announces itself. He was devastated in the way that devastation settles into a person when the shock has passed, and the reality has not yet become something they know how to hold. He told William what he had said to Camilla earlier that evening, that she had made him complicit in her deception. That every time he had defended her publicly, every statement, every appearance, every moment he had asked the British people to extend her the benefit of their doubt, he had been doing so on behalf of someone who was lying to him about the fundamental structure of her life. His question to William, according to those briefed on the conversation, was not about titles or parliamentary process or institutional liability. It was simpler and far more painful than any of that. He asked whether William thought she had ever truly been who he believed her to be. William did not have an answer. Neither, it seemed, did Charles. In the days that followed, palace staff reported that the king had aged visibly, moving through his scheduled duties with mechanical precision, but without the particular ease that had always characterized him when Camilla was near. He had relocated from Clarence House to Buckingham Palace, apartments he had long described as too cold and too formal. He had chosen the crown over the marriage, and in doing so, had ended up more alone inside the palace than he had been in years. But none of them yet understood how this had really begun or how ordinary the starting point had actually been. It began with something genuinely boring. In the spring of 2025, Parliament passed legislation requiring enhanced financial transparency for senior royals receiving public funding. It was not targeted at any individual. It was the kind of modernization measure that governments periodically introduce when public pressure for institutional accountability reaches a level that can no longer be managed through reassurance alone. Independent audits, full disclosure of assets, quarterly reporting of significant transactions, standard governance reform, the sort of thing that should, in theory, produce nothing more interesting than a large quantity of properly filed paperwork. The audit firm Reynolds Partners began their comprehensive review in September. They started with the most senior figures, which meant the king first and then the Queen Consort's office. And the Queen Consort's finances, by every reasonable expectation, were going to be the least complicated portion of the entire exercise, an allowance from the Duchy of Lancaster, some personal wealth carried over from a previous marriage settlement. Household expenses, properly documented and categorized. Nothing that anyone anticipated would require more than routine verification. Nobody expected to find anything interesting. An auditor named Sarah Mitchell was reviewing payment authorizations sometime in October when she noticed something small. Monthly payments approximately £5,000, each directed to what appeared to be a financial management firm registered in Luxembourg. The amounts were not large by the standards of a senior royal household, but they were not properly categorized within the palace accounting system, and when Mitchell requested supporting documentation explaining what these payments were for, the responses that came back were vague. Something about estate management services. No specificity, no referenced contracts, no identifiable estates. Anyone who has spent time working in financial compliance understands what vague answers to specific questions represent. They are not administrative oversights. They are signals. Mitchell followed standard protocol and requested direct communication with the Luxembourg firm. What she discovered was that the entity managed no legitimate estates with any connection to Camilla. It was a shell company. Its primary function was to receive funds from various sources and distribute them onward to accounts held in Camilla's name, spread across multiple jurisdictions. The shell company itself was owned by another corporate entity registered in the British Virgin Islands. Deliberate layers. Deliberate obscurity. The kind of structure that does not appear by accident and cannot be explained away as administrative carelessness. Mitchell escalated to her senior partners. The palace was brought in. Forensic accountants were engaged. And the picture that began emerging as those accountants followed the threads outward from that single Luxembourg address was nothing like the straightforward household audit that everyone involved had expected to complete quietly, without incident. What they found did not look like an oversight. It looked like a system. And the question of who had built that system and why was about to take the investigation somewhere that nobody inside the palace had remotely prepared for. Charles dismissed his private secretary at 7 o'clock. That alone was unusual. There are very few moments in a working sovereign's day that occur without at least one senior member of staff present, not because privacy is impossible, but because the machinery of monarchy operates on the assumption that someone is always nearby, always available, always within reach. Dismissing that presence entirely for an unscheduled private meeting communicated something before a single word of the meeting itself had been spoken. Only 2 protection officers remained, stationed at distance, standard security protocol that could not be waived regardless of circumstance. The documentation was already laid out across his desk when Camilla entered the study at 7:15. Bank statements, account opening records, corporate structures printed and organized in chronological order. Charles was sitting behind the desk rather than in the informal seating area where they typically spoke, a spatial choice that created a barrier between them that was as much emotional as it was physical. He did not speak immediately. He gestured for her to look. The silence, he would later tell William, was deliberate. He had wanted to believe, even then, that there was an explanation he had not yet considered, some administrative arrangement he had misunderstood, some innocent reason for decades of accounts he had never known existed. He sat quietly because he was, in those final moments before she responded, still giving her the benefit of a doubt that the documentation in front of them had already exhausted. Camilla's initial response was denial not of the accounts themselves, but of any wrongdoing. These were old accounts, she insisted, family money kept separately, nothing that had ever required formal disclosure. Charles pushed. The transaction records showed activity continuing throughout their marriage, through her time as Duchess of Cornwall, through her years as Queen Consort. This was not old money, quietly sitting untouched in a forgotten account. These were active, ongoing arrangements maintained through structures specifically designed to be difficult to trace. As he pressed further, presenting evidence of connections to individuals associated with Prince Andrew, deposits timed to periods when Andrew was known to be navigating serious financial and legal difficulties, the denials became less confident and more desperate. He asked her directly what she had been involved in. Because this, he told her, did not look like private savings. It looked like something else entirely. That was the moment Camilla's composure fractured. She insisted she had been trying to protect the family, that Andrew had come to her years earlier, desperate and without viable options, asking for help in ways that could not involve Charles directly, because involving Charles would have forced him to choose between his brother and his obligations as sovereign. The accounts, she claimed, had been structured to receive and hold funds that could eventually be moved to cover Andrew's mounting debts and legal costs. Charles listened to all of it. Then he asked her the question that mattered most to him personally, and her answer, hesitant and qualified, was the one thing he had not been prepared to hear. Charles asked her whether some of those accounts had already existed before they were married. Camilla's answer was hesitant, qualified, constructed in the careful way that people construct answers when the truth is something they have spent years rehearsing a different version of. But beneath the hesitation, the substance was clear enough. Some of the accounts had been opened before the marriage, others had been established afterward, none of them had ever been disclosed to him. And she had made that choice deliberately because she had known, she said, that he would have insisted they be closed or declared, and she had felt an obligation to Andrew that she could not abandon simply because it was inconvenient. That justification, according to those later briefed on the conversation, infuriated Charles more than the concealment itself. He told her what she had actually done. Every time he had stood beside her publicly and asked the British people to trust her every statement, every appearance, every moment, he had vouched for her character and her integrity. He had been doing so as a man who did not know the truth about the woman he was defending. She had not simply hidden money from him, she had allowed him to build his public credibility on a foundation she knew was false. He asked her whether she understood what she had done to his position, to the institution. The conversation deteriorated from there. Recriminations, emotional outbursts. 3 hours of it, long enough that those stationed outside the study could hear the register of voices change without being able to distinguish words. When Camilla emerged, palace staff reported she looked shattered. She moved directly to her private apartments without speaking to anyone. Charles called for his private secretary and legal counsel within minutes. His instructions were immediate and non-negotiable. He wanted a full legal analysis of what was constitutionally required to remove her titles. He wanted her departure from Clarence House arranged within 48 hours. And he wanted a statement prepared, not a diplomatic ambiguity, but a statement that explained, in terms the public could not misread, why this action was being taken. When senior advisors cautiously suggested that perhaps more time was needed, that the investigation should be allowed to run its full course before anything irreversible was set in motion, Charles did not waver. She had admitted substantial concealment, he told them. She had admitted those accounts were connected to Andrew's financial troubles. That was enough. He would not allow the Crown to remain associated with whatever arrangement she had been part of, not for another day, not while the legal process moved at its normal pace. The palace legal team began working through the night. What they discovered almost immediately was that what Charles wanted had never been done before, not in this form, not in this century, and that the constitutional machinery required to accomplish it was considerably more complex than his urgency wanted to allow. But the machinery had already begun moving, and once it started, nobody was going to stop it. The forensic accountants worked methodically, and the fuller picture they assembled, as the threads from that Luxembourg shell company were followed outward across multiple jurisdictions, was considerably larger and more troubling than the initial discovery had suggested. 3 separate accounts at banks in Geneva and Zurich opened between 2003 and 2005, carrying combined balances of approximately £3.2 million. Transaction histories showed regular deposits across many years, with minimal withdrawals suggesting these accounts were not being used for ordinary spending, they were being used for accumulation. Cayman Islands accounts opened in 2007 shortly after the marriage to Charles, containing balances exceeding £4 million. Funds appeared primarily UK-based in origin, but had been routed through intermediate accounts in ways specifically designed to obscure where they had started. The Luxembourg cluster, approximately £1.3 million, appeared to function as a collection point, gathering smaller payments from various directions before distributing them onward to the Swiss and Cayman accounts. The combined total exceeded £8.5 million, but it was not the amounts alone that troubled investigators most, it was the timeline. Deposits had continued regularly through 2024. This was not old money accumulated before public life and then forgotten. This was ongoing, active, deliberate concealment maintained throughout every year of her marriage, throughout her time as Duchess of Cornwall, throughout her years as Queen Consort. The structure had not been abandoned when she entered royal life. It had continued alongside it, and then the investigators found something that changed the nature of the question entirely. When forensic accountants began tracing the origins of specific deposits, certain patterns emerged that no one inside the palace had anticipated. Significant sums had arrived in the accounts within weeks of Camilla hosting events attended by wealthy individuals with specific commercial interests. Other deposits followed periods during which she had publicly advocated for causes that benefited particular industries. No direct exchange could be proven. No explicit arrangement was documented anywhere that investigators could find. But the pattern repeated across multiple years, involving multiple depositors, consistent enough in its timing to be statistically difficult to dismiss as coincidence, created a question that was, in many ways, more damaging than the hidden accounts themselves. Had Camilla's position as Queen Consort been treated, by someone or by several people, as something with a financial value? And if so, had she known? This is the detail that divided opinion more sharply than anything else in the entire investigation. Because there are only two honest answers to that question, and neither of them is comfortable. If she had known, then the concealment was not simply a family matter, it was something considerably more serious. And if she had not known if the deposits had arrived, and she had asked no questions about their origin, then the question of who had been using her position and for how long had not yet been answered. That investigation was still unfolding, and William had known about all of it 3 days before his father did. William had been briefed on the 25th of November. Palace legal counsel walked him through the documentation in careful sequence, the account structures, the jurisdictions involved, the timeline of deposits, the patterns that investigators had found troubling enough to escalate beyond routine financial review. They presented it methodically, the way difficult information is always presented to someone whose reaction will matter institutionally, factually, completely, and without editorializing. William listened to all of it. And his first question, when they had finished, was not about Camilla, it was about his father. He asked whether there was any possibility that Charles had known. Whether the investigation had found anything, any communication, any transaction, any suggestion that the king might have been aware of the accounts and had failed to disclose them alongside everything else. The question was not accusatory. It was the question of a man who understood, with absolute clarity, that the answer would determine not just what had happened, but what the public would inevitably ask next. The investigation had found no evidence that Charles knew. None. But William recognized, as he sat with that answer, that the absence of evidence and the absence of public doubt were two entirely different things. The question would be raised regardless. Managing that perception, protecting his father from an accusation that the facts did not support, would be almost as difficult as managing the scandal itself. He carried all of that for 3 days before Charles was told. When William was summoned to Clarence House at midnight on the 2nd of December, the night before the statement was to be released, he found his father in a private sitting room, not the formal spaces where the institution conducts its business. Charles was not performing composure. There was no audience left to perform it for. Charles told him this was not an emotional reaction. He said it quietly, and with the particular deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed a sentence because they need to believe it themselves. She had created institutional liability through deliberate deception. As king, he could not overlook that regardless of what it cost him personally. William agreed that action was necessary. He suggested, carefully, that more time might allow for a cleaner legal process, something less open to the constitutional questions that would inevitably follow. Charles refused. Every day she remained Queen Consort, while the concealment was known, was another day of institutional dishonesty. It ended now. Then William asked his father something that had nothing to do with titles or parliamentary procedure or the preservation of the monarchy's public image. He asked what happened to Charles after this. Not the king, the man. Charles was quiet for a long moment. Those briefed on the conversation did not record his answer, only that the silence preceding it was long enough to be its own kind of response, and that when he finally spoke, what he said was not something either of them would repeat to anyone else. William issued his public statement of support the following morning. He had chosen his father over his uncertainty. Whether that had been the right choice was something he was still working out. At 6:47 in the morning, the statement left the palace. By 7 o'clock, the first television anchors were reading it aloud with the particular careful neutrality of people who are genuinely uncertain what expression is appropriate. By 8 o'clock, royal correspondents who had covered the monarchy for 20 and 30 years were using the word unprecedented with a frequency that suggested the word itself was becoming insufficient. By midday, the story had crossed every border that royal news typically respects, and the conversation it had started showed no sign of narrowing into anything manageable. Britain divided, not quietly and not evenly. Older viewers, particularly those who remembered what Camilla's public rehabilitation had actually cost her, who had watched her endure years of hostility and had eventually extended her the acceptance she had worked so carefully to earn, responded with something that looked less like outrage and more like grief. Many felt the punishment was disproportionate. Financial irregularities, however serious in their structure, did not seem to them a sufficient reason to destroy everything a person had spent 2 decades rebuilding. She had served, she had shown up, she had, by almost any visible measure, become what the institution had asked her to become. Younger demographics saw it differently. Hidden millions accumulated quietly, concealed deliberately, maintained through sophisticated offshore structures throughout years of public service, read not as a private matter, but as a fundamental betrayal of the implicit contract between the monarchy and the people whose taxes contributed to its existence. The sophistication of the concealment was the detail that landed hardest. Shell companies in Luxembourg, accounts across multiple continents. This was not an oversight, this was architecture. The international reaction fractured along lines that revealed how differently the same story could be read depending on where you were standing. American media, never entirely comfortable with Camilla given the enduring weight of Diana's narrative in their cultural memory, framed the scandal as a long-delayed reckoning. European outlets, more accustomed to the financial complexities that occasionally surface around royal households, treated it as serious but not unprecedented. Commonwealth nations watched with particular anxiety. Instability at the center of the monarchy carried implications for their own constitutional arrangements that made detachment impossible. Camilla's children responded publicly and with evident sincerity. In a joint statement, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes insisted their mother had been motivated entirely by a desire to protect the family, that her concealment had been the concealment of someone trying to help Andrew navigate impossible circumstances. Without drawing Charles into situations that would have forced him to choose between loyalty to his brother and the obligations of his office, the defense was heartfelt. It was also immediately met with the one question that nobody defending Camilla had a clean answer to. If this had been nothing more than a family member helping another family member through a difficult period, why did it require shell companies? Why did it require accounts across 3 continents? Why did it require structures specifically designed to make the money difficult to trace? Sincerity, it turned out, was not the same as explanation, and the investigation was still not finished. There are moments in public life when what is not said communicates more precisely than anything that is. The engagement had been scheduled weeks in advance. A formal state occasion of the kind that cannot be quietly canceled without generating a secondary story larger than the one it was meant to avoid. The palace had made the decision carefully and after considerable internal discussion that proceeding was preferable to the questions that postponement would inevitably raise. The institution needed to be seen continuing. That, in itself, was a message the palace wanted delivered. Charles arrived with William and Catherine. The formation was the first thing those who followed royal appearances closely noticed. Not dramatically different, not rearranged in any way that announced itself, but different enough to the eyes that had spent years reading the subtle language of who stands where and who walks beside whom to be immediately legible. Catherine occupied a position in the procession that, for the preceding 2 years, had belonged to someone else. She carried it with the composure that had always characterized her public presence, and with a visible, careful attentiveness that suggested she understood precisely the weight of what she was now being asked to hold. Charles moved through the engagement with the mechanical precision of someone performing a role they have inhabited for so long that the body can execute it independently of whatever the mind is doing elsewhere. He greeted, he spoke, he listened. Every gesture landed in the right place at the right moment. 50 years of preparation does not disappear under the pressure of personal devastation. It becomes, if anything, more automatic. But those who had watched him for a long time noticed something missing beneath the precision. There was an ease, a particular quality of relaxed presence that had always characterized him when Camilla was nearby, that was simply absent. Not replaced by anything visible, just gone. The way a room feels different when furniture that has always occupied a specific corner has been removed, not dramatically altered, not obviously worse, but somehow acoustically changed in a way that takes a moment to identify. The moment that became the image of that day happened during a routine exchange with a child near the front of the crowd. A small bouquet presented in the particular earnest way that children present things at royal events. Charles accepted it with genuine warmth that, at least, required no performance. And then, for a fraction of a second, he turned slightly to his right. An instinct. Involuntary and immediate and over before most cameras caught it cleanly. The instinct to share a small moment with someone who was not there. He recovered without breaking stride, continued, said something to William that made the moment pass naturally. But the cameras caught it. That image, 2 seconds of unguarded human reflex, circulated more widely than any statement the palace had issued, more than any parliamentary vote, more than any headline. Nobody needed a caption. Everybody already understood. In the weeks that followed, the investigation continued. New details emerged regularly. Constitutional scholars debated the precedent that had been set. Parliamentary committees discussed the implications of what had occurred. The public conversation showed no sign of reaching a conclusion that satisfied everyone because the story itself did not have a conclusion of that kind. But beneath all of it, quieter and more permanent than any official proceeding, something else had already settled into place. Charles had protected the institution. He had done what he believed duty required, had chosen transparency over discretion, accountability over forgiveness, the crown over the marriage. He now lived in Buckingham Palace apartments he had long described as too cold and too formal. The irony was precise and painful. In choosing the monarchy above everything else, he had ended up more physically surrounded by it and more personally alone inside it than at any previous point in his reign. Camilla's rehabilitation, earned across 2 decades of disciplined, relentless public service, had been erased in 72 hours. Whatever her motivations had truly been, whatever Andrew's role in the arrangement, whatever the full and unresolved truth of those accounts across 3 continents, she had concealed something enormous from the man who had spent the better part of his life defending her. That fact existed independently of every explanation offered for it. Her children's defense had been genuine. It had also arrived too late to change what the documentation had already made permanent. William carried the weight of choices made under impossible pressure. His private doubts about the constitutional precedent being set about whether parliamentary power should ever be used this way, about what it meant for the permanence of positions earned through decades of service, remained unresolved. He had chosen loyalty to his father over his uncertainty. Whether that had been wisdom or simply love dressed as institutional judgment was something he was still quietly working out. Catherine had assumed responsibilities she had anticipated having considerably more time to grow into. Friends described her as equal to it, also as privately exhausted by the particular kind of weight that comes from being asked to represent stability during a period when the institution producing that stability was itself quietly fracturing along lines that nobody had yet fully mapped. And Charles, sitting alone in rooms that had never felt like home, moving through duties that his body knew how to perform, even when the rest of him did not know how to be present inside them, was left with the one question that no parliamentary process and no institutional decision could answer for him. He would never know with complete certainty whether Camilla had ever truly been who he believed her to be. Whether the version of her he had loved and defended and built his personal life around had been real, or whether it had been, in some fundamental way, a construction maintained alongside everything she had kept hidden, that uncertainty was not something the crown could resolve. It was something he would simply have to carry. Sometimes the price of wearing a crown is discovering that the person you trusted completely had been carrying a version of themselves you were never permitted to see, and that loving someone fully was never quite the same as knowing them truly.